Meet Delbert. Delbert is one of the first minis I printed, and he might look okay, but look a little bit closer. Delbert is missing a hand and had a broken arm because of me. It's not my printer, it was not my filament, it was just me. There's no other reason except I didn't prepare his file correctly, and it just printed wrong. The printer did exactly what it was supposed to do. Today I am going to teach you how to minimize those times when your prints will fail because of prep work. Before I go there, I just want us to pause for a moment to remember Delbert's hand. Thank you very much. So much of the success of a print depends on what you tell the printer to do. For those who might not be so familiar with 3D printing terms, you'll take a 3D object that you get. Usually it's an STL format, or maybe it's in an OBJ, an object format, and you'll insert it into a program called a slicer. And that slicer converts that object into a language that the printer understands, and it knows exactly what to do, how to move to form that object. And so it'll slice it into different layers, because that's how 3D printers work. They some way or another lay down layers and form the object, kind of build it up from nothing. Called slicing or prepping the file, massaging, loving the file. But we call it slicing. I'm just going to kind of walk through all the things that I do before that have helped me avoid having another Delbert. Let's get into it. First thing you want to do is you're going to want to find your file. So I like Thingiverse. There's like a billion other places you can go. I'm sure throughout this series and throughout this channel's history, you're going to see me link to a lot of different places. You can find good files anywhere. Even sometimes you'll find hobbyists that want to just see, hobbyist modelers just want to see what their files look like printed, see their stuff come to life. So you're going to want to put it into your slicer of choice. The most common ones are Cura and Simplify 3D, and you're going to want to see, is it slicing well? What do I mean by that? You can find real quickly whether your slicer understands this file or whether there's any gaps in it. Sometimes the issue is you have a corrupt file, a corrupt STL. Other times it's that your slicer just isn't reading it well. Sometimes people design their files to work well in a specific slicer. You're going to have to find the layer view. In Cura, this literally says layer view. In Simplify 3D, you're going to have to prep the file and look at it specifically. In this case, you can see it might look like from far this plane that I'm looking at is okay, but it's not. If the model is not slicing well, you're going to want to look for an STL repair program. There's Mesh Mixer, which is free software too that you can use, Mesh Lab, NetFab Basic, NetFab Cloud Service. I've tried all of them, and the one that works best for me personally is a totally separate one called the Microsoft 3D STL Repair. You literally go online. It's a super quick website. I'll include in the link below. Drag and drop, and then wait till it's done, and then click, and you get your file. This is the one that works for me, and I highly recommend it. It's super simple. Just need to log into Microsoft account and you're good to go. Okay, so next thing you want to do while you're in this view is you're going to want to see the different layer heights. You will learn over time the limits of your printers. Capabilities of your printer. I've found you can usually push it a little bit lower, and there's no guarantee, but sometimes it works still really well. A lot of it has to do with your nozzle, but we'll get there. We'll cover that in another video. You're going to want to find the interval for your stepper motor. Every motor has an interval for their stepper, for their steps, for like their levels. And if you try to calculate, give it a number that's in between that, it'll do its best, but it's not going to be exact. So what you want to do is you want to find that out. You can find it in your manual. There's guides for that online. Usually people will tell you, you'll find ways in your user communities on Facebook and on Reddit for your printer. They'll tell you what the stepper motor is if you ask. Honestly, you want to look at different sizes, because some models will print better at higher layer heights. You'll download a file. Let's say this file is optimized for a 0.2 millimeter layer height, and you want to take them up for that and see if going lower really does make a difference. If you do go at print at a higher layer height, it's going to be a lot faster. There's going to be more layer lines. You're definitely going to notice it more. Depending on the pattern, it might not make much of a difference. So you got to test and you got to see. It also gives you a really good idea of what you're going to see when it comes out, even before it prints. You can, play with it a little bit to see specifically, okay, I like the way this looks. I like the way this is going to kind of feel. Sometimes it can produce these really organic feeling models depending on the orientation. Other times it doesn't. This guy I printed a while ago, he's like a deep one from Duncan Shadow Luca. Most of the time, if you're talking miniatures, terrain, we're dealing with pretty organic shapes. And it's just a general rule of thumb that the lower layer heights look better and more detailed. You won't see as much of those layer lines, which are famous for FDM printers, right? We're trying to avoid that. That's what this channel and this sort of thing is all about. You want to take this opportunity to look at different orientations. You want to clone the model a few times and change it, move it around, put it on its back. And you want to do this because some orientations will print better than others, depending on the model. Each model is different in my experience. Some people will swear by leaning their minis at a 45-degree angle. Others will insist, you got to lay it flat on its back. Others will say, no, I got to print straight upwards. And nobody does this or this. These are pretty much the go-tos for minis in particular. A general rule of thumb with terrain is if there's a flat surface, and that's the way it's going to be, you lay it flat on that surface and you work with the supports at that point. The layer view will allow you to see what it's going to look like in these different orientations. What curves will look bad if you have it on its back, if you have it on the side, what layer views will be pronounced. So if there's a very fine detail area, you can see pretty much which way is going to look better. Some printers have better resolutions for different axis, whatever that is. For example, my CR-10 has much better detail on my Z axis. So sometimes laying a model flat is going to give me worse detail, even though it's safe for print. And I push the limits. I think you should too. If you really want good prints, sometimes you have to try a few orientations with a mini before you get used to it. Something to consider is where the supports are going to go when you're orienting it. Like I said, the whole reason Delbert didn't print is because I had no supports going here and he just fell. Lucky that I even got this much of his arm still. It was kind of like, I'm mumble jumbled, right? And that's what's going to happen. In some cases, it will fail and destroy the rest of your print. And if it's expensive, obviously we don't want to do that. A little small mini, you can kind of handle a failed print. It'll look like spaghetti. We don't want that. We want better prints, right? That's what we're doing. If you lay your model on its back, this was printed in different pieces, but if you lay it on its back, check it out. You can see the artifact right here in these areas and here. You can see the artifact. From the front, it looks good. You can't tell really. You don't see any of those things because of the way I printed it. This model is going to be facing, it's going to be facing forward most of the time. So I was okay with that. So if you're going to stand it up, a failure is a lot more obvious. Might not be salvageable. And if you keep the base on, you might have some support material still left on the base. So keep that in mind. It's not a problem if you end up covering the base with like sand or something like that. But if you want it to be flat, then just keep that in mind because you'll have some more sanding to do, some more post-processing afterwards. At an angle is a good compromise most of the time. Some layers like the face, for example, they can look a little weird because the direction of the filament is laying down. But, aren't we glad that we're looking at this in layer height? Because that's why we do this before. We want to get a good idea of everything that can happen, what it's going to look like before we even print. So we don't try face down, period. Let's move on. If you are printing a piece of terrain that has an obviously flat surface, in some cases you have to consider flattening. There's this kind of like pillowing that happens. I struggle to get rid of it and sometimes, so I just kind of deal with it and either cut it off and then sand afterwards, or just deal with it and accept that it's going to be like that. Maybe use some green stuff if I really want to. It was a super flat surface. It made super gluing so easy and so good. I had no sanding, no post-processing there, but I have a line on my rocks now. For terrain, that's something to consider. Minis, we don't really have this issue as much unless you're printing straight off a base. A lot of people will split the mini from the base in an app like in a software like Mesh Mixer. A lot of people will separate them and then just print their mini so the supports can be more natural. And then they'll print the base alone and then put it together like you would any other mini. The other thing is, if you're using something like a mini or terrain that has an obviously flat surface, My recommendation is not to use a raft unless there's a lot of support material that's going to justify it. Support material prints so much better on a raft, but if you have flat surfaces, it's a pain in the butt to remove all of it. And then if you have to glue one side of the flat surface to the other, it's going to be difficult. Again, with this example, with these, if I'd had material here in between, it would not look like this. It would be like my dragon. This is totally my fault, but right here, there's a gap. That gap was supposed to be perfectly matched, but it's not, because I printed it with a raft, and there's a lot of support material on the dragon's bottom end of his face. Me being me, I didn't shave it off and I didn't clean it up, and now I have to face the consequence. And in other words, I have to use some green stuff on this. Hey, impatient. Keep that in mind when you're doing this. Use a raft. It's going to be great for supports, but you're going to have some cleanup to do afterwards. If you go flat, you might have some pillowing. You might still have some cleanup to do afterwards. So finding the right balance is going to be important. Just keep in mind whichever you use. The best idea is to use whatever's going to be viable with allowing the minimum amount of post-processing. You will have to learn your printer and what works. Okay? All right. Sport time, baby. Try the auto supports first. In some programs, this works pretty well. In others, it is not reliable. Rule of thumb, Simplified 3D has given me a lot of issues with auto supports, and Cura is pretty good with auto supports. But the difference is that Simplified 3D doesn't put enough in the right spots, and so that's how I ended up with my little baby over here. I assumed Simplified 3D would be good, and it just didn't work for me. Cura got me one of these guys. I had so much supports here between his swords, I wasn't able to remove it. And I was like, this is too good for me. And I had to figure it out. I had to play with the settings until I found something that worked for me, specifically a profile that worked for me. I ended up using Simplified 3D more often and just learning to work with the supports and playing with the settings. So now you're going to try the auto supports and you're going to inspect the mini in layer view. You need to make sure there aren't any obvious appendages missing support. Look for overhangs that are, 40, 50 degrees or over. Some people push their printers to 60 degrees if they have like cooling fans and stuff like that. I've found generally anything over 40, 45 even can start failing. That's been my experience. And so I know that's something I need to work on. My experience, that's beyond the average user like us. So I'm going to do, assume that you're trying to just avoid, you're trying to minimize failures, and you're going to overcompensate. And if you have a style like me, you're okay post-processing if it just means that, that 8-hour print runs straight through the 8 hours. There are plenty of guides if you want to fine-tune your printer to get there. If there's any simple step that has made my print success skyrocket, it is this one. A printer, for the most part, can't print in thin air. You got to make sure your mini is always printing on something, or prepare to do more finishing work. Some tips to help with supports. I predominantly use Simplified 3D because I like adding my own supports. There's other, software that allows you to do that. I don't like adding them, and I like Simplified 3D's printing outside of that. So I use it and I just work with this fault. I over support a lot of my minis. Why do I do that? Because I'd rather have a mini that I can feel relatively comfortable, will print well, especially if it's a big model like Dragon, Aboleth. I'd rather have the support with the artifact and be able to clean it up later than to have wasted a quarter roll of filament coming back from work. That's a lot of money. My printer's going while I'm at work or while I'm sleeping, and that's just my personal preference. I recommend it for you too. You're going to have to spend a lot of time either way configuring your printer to make sure that you're comfortable enough to let it go. It's up to you. It's your preference, right? But these are just guidelines that have helped me, and I think that they'll help you as a new or an experienced printer. There are members of the 3D printing community who have got their prints down to set it and forget it. It's possible. Over supporting is my way of compensating when I'm running short on time to do overhang tests and print tests. And, I don't mind. I'd rather do 5 to 10 minutes of extra cleanup than waste the filament and the time printing. That's more important to me. That's my priorities. And I think it'd be a good priority skill set for anybody who's relatively new, who's trying to work through the hobby, right? Another thing I do is I remove the base in Mesh Mixer. You separate the shells and then you print the base separate from the mini. I use a raft for most minis that don't have a base because there's a lot of supports involved, and I'd rather just have to remove the feet and have to glue the feet back, which is usually the piece that comes apart when I try to separate the the raft from the Mini itself because of a lack of support. But I'd rather remove their feet from the raft, have to glue those back. It just makes the rest of the piece, the failure, a lot less likely when you're dealing with small supports. So now the part that's not universal is printer settings. For the most part, the 3D printing community has been paved with trailblazers, super techie people who have taken a concept and run with it. Why do I bring this up? Because more established models, printers, and designs have larger communities. So the larger and more established the community, the more likely there are to be, trailblazers doing the nitty-gritty troubleshooting that the average person like me struggles with. Example, I have a Creality CR-10 and I'm in a Facebook user group with over 30,000 people in it from all over the world. A TiVo Tarantula has, 43K members in their group. ANET has over 55,000 people in theirs. And, even though the FL Sun is considered a Prusa clone, like an ANET, it's only got 3.6K members. The 3D Cube, 993 members. A Wanhao Duplicator 7, which is, one of the more affordable print resins. It comes up all the time when people talk about mini printing. Only 6,000 members in there. 1,000 in another group. Another 330 in a dental group. Quite niche. Anycubic Photon DLP printer. Also, another printer, resin printer that comes up all the time when people mention miniatures because it's more affordable. 506 members. These are newer printers, and troubleshooting them, the technology, it's newer. If you buy a newer printer or choose to back a Kickstarter printer, you will be swimming against the current, and you can be a trailblazer, and I hope you will be, but finding the right settings is going to take a long time. It works for some people, but just keep in mind that it doesn't for others. You know yourself, whether you'll be comfortable with that type of learning curve and being a trailblazer, or if you're not, if you want the bigger community to be able to rely on that larger pool of people that are putting in a lot of the work to just help the community. One thing I do want to say is that, less users doesn't mean there won't be any support. It might take a little bit longer, or you might be at the mercy of the printer manufacturer. To channel my inner Liam Neeson. Good luck. My simple recommendation, if you haven't bought a printer yet, consider the size of the support and user community. There's more than Facebook. Facebook is just one of the fastest ways to get feedback in my experience. It's faster than forums, Reddit, definitely the company a lot of the time. If you have bought one and you haven't joined your user group or found an online forum where those trailblazers are, you got to find it. You will learn something there, I promise. In my user group, people they share their settings all the time. It's a simple file and I plug and play. I try to tweak anything that might come up after I run my first print, but these settings are usually really good baseline in my experience. If I have any questions, I post, and I've got comments almost immediately because my printer has a large active community of users of all skill levels. It's a Creality CR-10, like I've mentioned before. A lot of people in the 3D printing community want to help, especially in your printers community. You just got to find those people. So grateful to people like him and others like him who do what they do just because they love 3D printing and contributing to the community. And I tip my hat to you, good sir. This increased my print quality instantly. It was easy. Just needed to do it. Thing you want to do, you want to double check the settings after importing that profile that you find from your trailblazers. Once you have a profile you want to use, you double check some of the settings that might have looked good but might be different. So for example, a setting was optimized to 0.2 millimeters. I lower that to 0.12. I have to change that, otherwise I'm going to have a big print, right? When you're printing smaller models, usually 30 millimeters or smaller, it made a really big difference for me when I started to slow down my prints. It's about 30 millimeters per second. I got less artifact, I got cleaner prints, especially if I was printing a single mini. Now it's test time, and at this point you should be ready to slice your file and start a perfect print. If you're like me, you might run a few different orientations. You might try a few with more or less supports and run 2 or 3 models at a time. You probably have a few different options to try if you are feeling brave. And remember, if you want to get better prints, you need to see what works and print until you figure out your machine. Every print is going to get easier and easier to troubleshoot. You will see what went wrong and whether it was an issue with the slice or whether it was a mechanical issue with your hardware or something like adhesion. If you enjoyed this video or if it helped, I would love to hear from you down in the comments below. If you have any additional questions that you'd like me to answer, happy to share that with you. I hope that this has helped. Thanks again for watching, and see you around.